Hey, sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to B-Ball Breakdown. We have James Carty with us for part two of our NBA draft preview as we dive into a bunch of new players that are very exciting who should have some high hopes to do well in the NBA. James, how are you this morning?
Doing great, Nick. Thanks for having me back on. Looking forward to talking about some of these guys today.
My pleasure. And as always, James is a scout who's done work for NBA and college teams and is always on the lookout for young, great new talent. And so let's jump right into it with Ben McLemore out of Kansas. Tell me what you see about him and whether or not you think he's going to actually be a good pro.
Well, Nick, he had a very impressive freshman year at Kansas this year. Still a young guy. He just turned 20 back in February, so he's still got a lot of room to grow. Tremendous outside shooter. He's one of those guys who's going to shoot about 40%. And I also like how versatile he is from outside. He's able to run off screens, catching rhythm off ball reversals or kickouts. He's one of those guys who kind of works to get open. And, in the same way that you see Ray Allen, especially back in his Celtics days, how they'd be running him off screens and he'd be popping out there and hitting those. McLemore has the same type of game as a perimeter shooter.
Yeah, I think we might have to go back to his Sonics days even to talk about Ray Allen because it's rare that you see a guy who's this athletic who can really shoot the ball well. And I know he's been inconsistent as a young player, but there certainly seems to be a lot of room for growth and maturity. But he's got an NBA body already.
Yeah, he does. He's an athletic guy who can really assert himself as a finisher in transition and also on defense. He needs to get more experience on the defensive end. The effort's there. He's got the physical tools. It's just a matter of getting used to the speed of the game, especially in the NBA, and being able to make those split-second decisions that you need to make to contribute as a defensive guy in the NBA. So it might take a little bit of time for that to happen and some good teaching, but I have no doubt he'll get there.
Great, absolutely. I see him doing very well. He'll probably go early, and there's no doubt in my mind. There's very few situations that I can picture that he won't do well because he's such a good athletic guy. I guess the only question is, can he create his own shot?
Yeah, and from what I've seen, the answer to that is no, and it's not something that I'd be terribly encouraged is going to happen. So, to answer your question, I think the key for him would be being paired with a team that passes the ball pretty well, especially a team that has a good point guard who can get him the ball in rhythm and put him in a position to succeed.
Okay, and so any chance that he could be a solid number two ball handler for a team?
From what I've seen so far, no, but again, he's only about 20 years old, so there's definitely time, but so far I haven't really seen the kind of flashes that you look for from a young kid, to build upon.
Well, let's move on to Alex Len, a guy who sort of appeared suddenly in the draft landscape, in my mind, out of Maryland, a big kid who's got some ability. I've seen some of his tape. He can move really well. What do you think his ceiling is?
Well, I think he's got one of the highest ceilings of anybody in the draft, Nick. He's got that foot injury that worries me a little bit. We could talk about that in a minute. But as a player, like you said, he's big, he's long, he's athletic, he's got a lot of skill. He can convert from either block. He moves well. He's shown a lot of potential to me as a pick-and-roll guy. He hasn't really shown that he can be like a pick-and-pop type guy who can step out there and hit the jumper yet. But as a roll man, he does very well. And if you get him the ball down on the block, he can make a lot of things happen. And there's simply not that many big 7-foot prospects these days who come into the draft at his age who have that kind of skill down there.
What kind of range are we talking with pick and pop? I mean, is he going to go back to the three-point line, or are we talking mid-range?
I've seen him hit from a little bit from mid-range. I definitely think that's something he's got to keep developing to diversify his game a little bit. But he's shown some nice touch out there already, and he's improved as a free throw shooter too. He went from, I think he was around like 55, 56% as a freshman, and then in his sophomore year he was closer to 70%. So it's good to see that kind of development from him, and that'll obviously help him stay on the court late in games, which is really valuable for a young center.
Yeah, he's obviously very skinny. He's still very young and needs to gain a lot of weight with a great wingspan. He looks to me almost like a traditional center, like the kind of guy we haven't seen in a while, who really makes his living around the basket, getting rebounds, posting up a little bit, and not doing a lot of stretch activity at all.
Yeah, that's kind of my impression of him too. Although he definitely has the physical skills and the mobility to contribute in transition and running the pick and roll too. So I like the kind of versatility that he brings, but I think his best assets for sure are his skill down on the low block, because there's not many guys these days who can do those kinds of things.
How worried are we? How worried are we about his injury issues?
Well, personally, Nick, I'm kind of worried. I mean, if I were picking in the top couple picks in the draft, I'd be afraid to take him. I don't have any insider information. I don't, I haven't seen his medical records. I don't know, but these days I'm kind of wary of some of the 7-footers out there who have lower leg injuries at his age. We haven't seen a lot of those guys really bounce back from that too well.
Right. Well, we'll have to see, but certainly he's impressive of what we've seen when he's been on the court. Let's move on to our next profile, and that is a small guy, Trey Burke out of Michigan, who made a big splash in the tournament. What do you see from him? Is he going to be the next good point guard out of college?
I definitely see him as being a very good point guard out of college. In watching tape on him, I was just impressed over and over again with how well he ran the pick and roll. He's a guy who can hit floaters, he can pull up, he can get to the rim, he finds guys open around the rim, he can hit the roll man, he finds shooters. He really, to me, does everything that you look for from a big-time pick and roll point guard.
So the only issue I see is that I don't know exactly if that 6'1" height is completely accurate. I think he might be pushing a little bit smaller than that. So does he have that kind of water bug quickness that can make up for lack of height?
I think he'll be okay defensively. He doesn't have the kind of height on offense in the same way that Michael Carter-Williams does that'll help him see the floor better. But defensively, he's got a solid wingspan. He played pretty good defense at Michigan, so I don't really worry about him too much defensively. Plus, I mean, let's face it, in today's NBA with the rules and all the elite point guards out there aren't that many guys in the same vein of like an Avery Bradley who really are, lockdown defenders at the guard position anymore. So I think you can scheme for that and get away with it a little bit more than you used to.
What kind of player do you think he's most like that's in the NBA right now?
I think it's kind of tough to say for me personally. I definitely see him as being best in like a ball screen type of offense. One of the things that made him so successful at Michigan was not only did they do a lot of pick and roll stuff, but they had a really good pick and roll big man in Mitch McGary, and they had guys around him like Stauskas and Hardaway Jr. and Robinson who can really shoot and space the floor a little bit. So if he ends up in a similar position in the NBA, I think he can be very successful, although I'd be a little concerned if he ended up with a team, maybe kind of like Sacramento or somebody who doesn't have that kind of floor spacing to help him and who also doesn't really have like a big-time pick-and-roll kind of guy who can work with him. So I feel like to be most successful, we'd want to try to emulate the same kind of personnel he had at Michigan.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on to our next profile, Cody Zeller, another big man out of Indiana, the brother of Tyler, the better brother apparently. And so what do you think from him? There's been a lot of hype surrounding him as far as how good he can be. He's still ridiculously young as well. What do you think? Is he going to make a splash?
I think he definitely can. First off, one of the things I keep hearing coming out of his workouts and from the pre-draft combine is how freakishly athletic he is. I think he's going to surprise a lot of people in that regard, and I really like his potential as like a pick-and-roll kind of big man who can run the floor and finish in transition, and I really like his ball handling. He's not an ISO guy necessarily, but he's one of those guys who can get the ball while flashing in the lane and score off a couple dribbles, and that's really valuable because you don't see too many 7-footers these days who can handle like that and kind of get their own shot off a couple dribbles in the lane and finish.
I will say this, a lot of people loved Oladipo on Indiana, but whenever Zeller went out, they struggled. And that was a real key for me to see how valuable Zeller really is as a player all around on both ends of the floor.
Definitely, Nick, definitely. I'd like to see him get a little stronger, especially on the defensive end. And watching some film, it seemed like when he was guarding guys around the basket, they made an a high amount of their shots, which, while shooting on a 7-footer, you'd think a lot of those would be pretty contested, but it didn't seem like he did as good of a job as I'd like to see in terms of protecting the rim and altering some of those shots. So getting stronger and getting some more experience there would definitely be helpful for him.
Yeah, I see that. I'm not so sure I see him as a real strong post-up guy down low, at least yet. He doesn't have that kind of strength, although I do like his touch and his feel for the game. So I would expect that he might have a little bit of a learning curve. And as his brother did, his brother started to do well after the initial experience of what it's like being in the NBA. So I would expect to see a similar progression there.
Yeah, I think he's the kind of guy who can maybe contribute a little bit early. One team I kind of like for him would be the Sixers, where he could run the pick and roll all day long with Drew Holiday and make some early contributions in that regard, especially if they end up getting a center who can protect the rim a little more than Zeller is going to early on.
Yes, well, I think we have to find out who's going to actually coach the Sixers before we know what they're going to run. I don't know. I suddenly heard about maybe like Fizdale interviewing there or something. So we can be sure there'll be plenty of 5-out and pick and rolls for him.
Taking their time with that decision.
Let's move on to Shabazz Muhammad, a guy that if you were to commit to him as a college, you were immediately on the NCAA watch list, as UCLA found out quite rudely. What do we think about him and his prospects for the NBA?
Well, Nick, he's a little hit or miss to me in some regards. You know, I'm based out of Las Vegas as a scout, so I got to watch him play a bunch in high school. And he's always had the reputation of me as being like a natural scorer who can really get his own shot. And despite people talking about that, I've never really kind of seen that from him. To me, he's a very good spot-up shooter when he's got his feet set, even from three-point range. And he's a tremendous slasher. He might be the best off-ball slashing type prospect in the draft, one of those guys who moves well without the ball. And if you're a team who has a point guard who can get it to him in a position to score, he's a really strong finisher, and he can also get to the line very efficiently.
You know, the way he moves reminds me exactly of James Harden. It's the way, the physical way, you know, he's sort of deceptively athletic.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's got that kind of range like Harden did, but I'm not so sure Harden really had that range his first year either. So I would say, you know, that's a pretty high ceiling to put on him. I'm not so sold either. I feel like he had this moment in the middle of the UCLA this first year where he realized, wait a minute, I'm supposed to work really hard, and if I do work hard, then I'm actually going to do well. I find it hard to believe that that was a big revelation. It took him that long to figure out. What about his work ethic? What do you think about that?
I'm not really concerned about that at all. I remember watching him in high school. You know, he's a guy who's about 6'5", 6'6", and he was kind of bulky in high school. I think he was about 240. And, you know, then he kind of disappeared for a few months and went to UCLA. And I saw him at UCLA, and he dropped like 15, maybe even 20 pounds or so from the time he, you know, ended his time at Bishop Gorman here in Vegas to getting on campus at UCLA. And considering that he came in there as like the #1 or #2 prospect or, you know, recruit in the country, I don't really, you know, I don't see too many guys with that kind of hype who put in that kind of work on their body right away. So that definitely impressed me.
Well, that's good to know. Now, I think the negatives here are defense and outside shooting, and I certainly think that those are two big things that he's going to need if he wants to be successful in the NBA.
Well, I'm not too worried about him as an outside shooter. I think he's pretty solid there. You know, for me, I kind of wonder what kind of situation he'll end up with in the NBA. You know, like I said, if he's playing, like if he ends up getting, like falling out of the lottery and ending up in Boston or Cleveland where he could play with Rondo or Kyrie and, you know, they can do their thing and get him the ball in a position to score, I think he'll be really successful there. On the other hand, if he ends up with a team where they're kind of counting on him to be the shot creator both for himself and for the offense as a whole, I think he's going to struggle a little bit. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, I'm definitely not sold. I'm going to have one weary eye on him to see how well he's going to do. But I think you're right. I think he's very much of a situational guy, and it's really going to depend on where he goes and who picks him up.
Sure.
Let's move on to Anthony Bennett, another player who is undersized for his position, but certainly seems to have quite a bit of athletic ability to make up for any kind of size issue he might have. Give me your take.
Well, I think the fact that he has a 7-foot wingspan, Nick, helps him a little bit in terms of combating against a maybe size disadvantage that he'd face going against NBA power forwards. To me, the thing with him is just the versatility that he gives you on offense. He can spot up and shoot the three from outside. He can take bigger defenders off the dribble, and he's really strong. I think he measured in about 260 pounds or so at about 6'8". So he's kind of built like a tank and can really overpower some of the smaller defenders out there, you know, especially if he gets, you know, switched on to any smaller guys, you know, in the offense-defense transition.
Yeah, he's a bit of a throwback, actually, a guy that wants to get down and dirty. I guess you could say he's a little bit like Barkley in that way, or maybe like Anthony Mason, some sort of these big, you know, big shoulder guys who are a little bit undersized. I actually am most impressed with the way he does shoot the ball from outside. The mechanics aren't perfect, but he certainly seems to have figured out a way to get that ball to go in from deep.
Yeah, he can definitely hit it from out there. You know, my only question with regard to his shooting is if you're an NBA head coach and you've got a guy who's as strong as he is and built the way that he is, how much time are you going to scheme to have him stand out there on the perimeter and try to shoot threes? You know, I'm not really too sure. I think he can definitely contribute. He's certainly good enough, but in the context of an NBA offense, I'd expect to see him spend more time pounding people down low.
Yeah, I will have to see. I mean, I guess he could be that sort of stretch four and play that position, or even can he see time at the three?
I think he might be able to. It's going to kind of depend maybe a little bit on what team he's with. You know, some teams are kind of doing the small ball thing a little more. Some teams kind of have stretch fours. You can space the floor a little bit, and that might create the space for him to be able to isolate it and really post up some of the smaller threes out there in the NBA.
What are some of the concerns we might have about Anthony Bennett?
Well, I think one of the concerns, Nick, would be how he's going to fare on the defensive end. You know, it's definitely not a question of effort. He applies himself out there. He's got a pretty good feel for what he's doing. You know, I think just kind of with the way that he's built, it limits his lateral foot speed a little bit, and he's liable to getting taken off the dribble. And I think one of the problems rookies face these days, and we talked about it a little bit with McLemore earlier, is just getting used to the speed of the game. And right now, Bennett's kind of at a disadvantage because he's still young, he's still inexperienced, and he's just not quick enough to really be able to close out on guys, you know, to really be able to contest the shots in as quick of a way as you'd like to see.
Right. We'll see. I think he's a tweener. I think he's got an ability there. He could do well. It might take him a year or two to get really adjusted, but certainly he has some tools there that could help a lot of NBA teams. Let's move on to our next and last profile here, and that is Kentavious Caldwell-Pope out of Georgia. Who knew? Georgia is a bit of an unheralded program. However, going through the footage of him, I have to tell you, he might be one of the more impressive guys I've seen in any of our draft coverage up to this point.
Definitely, Nick. He's a guy that I've gotten to see a lot of film on and really looked at very closely. And I know a lot of mocks kind of have him projected to go in the top 10, like maybe number 9 in the Timberwolves. I've seen a lot. But he's still one of those guys to me who's really flying under the radar. And I think if he lands in the right situation, and I think Minnesota would be one of those situations, he can be really successful because he's a tremendous outside shooter. He shot like 38% from deep on 7 attempts per game at Georgia, used about 25% of their possessions. So I think when he ends up in the NBA with a team where he doesn't have to be the team's whole offense anymore like he was at Georgia, it's going to take a lot of pressure off him. It'll be even better.
Absolutely. Another guy who is a fantastic athlete but also a great outside shooter, a rare combination in my mind. So I see him, and also he's terrific at creating off the bounce.
Yes. Yes, he is. And looking at some of the stats on him, one thing I found really interesting, 33% of his jump shots his last season in college were off the dribble. And he drilled them, man. I saw him taking some shots like coming off a ball screen from about 25 feet out and just sidestepping and pulling up, and he was stroking those with impunity. It was really impressive.
Yeah, I'm actually very anxious to see him take control of, get in there and really do some damage and shock a lot of people because, again, I don't know how high of a radar he is on people's radar, and certainly I think this guy really, with his athletic ability, has a chance to do some remarkable things.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going a little bit higher than people expect. If he snuck into like the top 5 or 6, that really wouldn't surprise me too much. I think he's got the talent to be a big-time contributor as a three-point shooter and defender, and a guy who can create his own shot a little bit.
It's funny. Everyone's talking about this draft being a very weak draft, and quite honestly, you never know. It's a complete crapshoot. The last 10 years, there's only the number of players that actually become a starter is very small across any of these drafts. So, what is your take on this? Do you feel this is a weak draft?
No, Nick, not at all. I feel like this is a very strong draft. On one hand, we don't have the traditional superstar types that some people look for. There's no LeBron, there's no Wade, there's no Melo, there's no some of the guys we'll see next year like Andrew Wiggins perhaps. But there's a lot of guys this year. I think this draft is very deep in a lot of ways. We have a great number of players who can contribute, especially in terms of some like the specialists out there. We've got some guys late in the first round, some of the guys that we've talked about like Alan Crabb from Cal, and some other three-point shooting type guys like Tony Snell and Reggie Bullock, and there's also some rebounding type guys in the second round too who I think can make some big contributions. So maybe we don't have the superstar shot creator guys, but there's a lot of guys who will help NBA teams.
I agree. I think that there's going to be an interesting landscape here as we're now 4 or 5 years out of the one and done rule. You're now starting to see how that affects colleges. And what I would say is the guys that are going to come out and get drafted who played multiple college years are going to be infinitely more ready to produce right away. And I think when you see guys like Damian Lillard come in and do what he did, that's going to be an interesting blueprint going forward. So I wouldn't dismiss any of these guys you see that we've covered that have had at least 2 years of college basketball experience.
Definitely, man. And one of the things that I think contributes to the importance of experience is the way that NBA defenses are evolving over the last couple of years. We've seen the stuff that the Bulls do, that the Heat do, that the Celtics do. And I feel like it's more important than ever to have young guys who can step in and who have a good understanding of defense within a team context. And there's a few guys like this at the top of the draft, and they tend to be the more experienced guys. You know, like I mentioned McLemore, you know, I think he's got a little ways to go before he's ready to be a real contributor on an NBA defense.
Well, James, thanks for joining us for this great two-part series on breaking down the NBA draft and some of these high-profile players and some not high-profile players. Anxious to see how this is going to play out. And don't miss, sports fans, we're going to have a post-draft analysis examining how these players are going to fit on the teams that they are going to be playing for. And we'll have a lot more to come up. So don't miss that. James, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Looking forward to coming back and pumped for the draft.
You got it. I just make sure that, as you know, that we're not a channel, we're a conversation. Are you in?
I'm in.